A girl pushed open a door she had never opened before. 14 years old. Hands shaking. She sat across from the school counselor, pulled her coat tight, and didn't look up. Then she started talking. What she said over the next 40 minutes turned the counselor white. Grown men. Her own family. Things no child should have words for. But this girl had the words. She had been living it her whole life. She came from South Mountain. Shacks in the woods of Nova Scotia. No running water. No toilets. No contact with the outside world. Her family name was Goler. For a century, they had preyed on their own children behind closed doors. What happened after she spoke cracked open the most disturbing case in Canadian history. 16 charged. Hundreds of allegations surfaced. How did a whole community look away for that long? Stay with me on this one. The Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia is the kind of place they put on postcards. Rolling apple orchards. White clapboard farmhouses. Acadia University sitting pretty in the middle of Wolfville. A town so clean it almost looks staged. Tourists come for the tidal bore. Families come for the quiet life. Everything about the valley says, this is a good place. A safe place. The kind of place where nothing bad happens. But if you stood in the center of that valley and looked south, you'd see a ridge. Thick forest. Steep ground. No orchards up there. No postcards either. That ridge is South Mountain. And for over a century, the people who lived on it might as well have been on a different planet. Now here's what you need to understand. South Mountain wasn't just rural. It was forgotten. 30 or so family clans lived up there in tiny settlements carved out of the bush. Most of the shacks were built from scrap wood and tar paper. No plumbing. No electricity for some of them. Roads that turned to mud in the rain and ice in the winter. These families survived on welfare checks, odd jobs picking apples in the valley, foraging for berries, and hunting whatever they could find. They were poor in a way most Canadians in the 1980s didn't believe still existed inside their own borders. The Golers were one of those clans. Charles and Stella Goler sat at the top. Patriarch and matriarch. They lived with their 5 sons, their sons' families, and a growing number of grandchildren, all crammed into 2 collapsing shacks south of a place called White Rock. At any given time, 20 or more people slept under those roofs. Children shared mattresses on the floor. The rooms were small and dark. Garbage was thrown into the attic until it filled up completely, and then the kids were made to haul it all out. Then the cycle started again. Most of the adults had little schooling. Some had intellectual disabilities that went undiagnosed for decades. One of Charles and Stella's children, Cecil, was born paralyzed from the neck down and couldn't speak. He lived that way for over 50 years. The Golers rarely left the mountain. The valley people rarely went up. 2 worlds, 15 minutes apart by car, that almost never touched. But here's the thing. They did touch. Doctors in Kentville treated the Goler children when they showed up sick or injured. Social workers visited the shacks on routine checks. Teachers at valley schools saw the kids come in dirty, quiet, and flinching at sudden movements. People in town whispered about what went on up on the mountain. They used the word inbreeding. They used the word hillbilly. They turned the family name into a slur that children threw at each other on playgrounds. Kids in Wolfville called each other Goler, the way kids call each other stupid. Don't be such a Goler. It was a joke to them. Punchline. Nobody asked what the punchline actually meant. Because if anyone had asked the right questions, they would have found out that the abuse inside those shacks went back generations. Researchers later traced the pattern to at least the 1860s. Over 100 years. Fathers with daughters. Brothers with sisters. Uncles with nieces. Parents with their own grandchildren. The cycle repeated itself so many times that some of the adults didn't even understand it was wrong. When police eventually asked one older man about what happened in his home, he was genuinely confused by the question. He didn't know what the word incest meant. He just thought that was how families lived. And the children. Believe me, the children tried to get help. Starting around 1980, several Goler kids went to outsiders and told them what was happening. They told teachers. They told social workers. They said what was being done to them in plain language that left no room for misunderstanding. And every single time they were disbelieved, sent back, returned to the same shacks, the same adults, the same mattresses on the floor. And when the adults found out the children had talked, the children were punished for it. So the kids learned the lesson the world was teaching them. Don't talk. Don't tell. Nobody's coming for you. That was the world in January of 1984. A valley that looked like paradise. A mountain that held a nightmare. And a system of doctors, social workers, teachers, and neighbors who had every reason to know the truth and every excuse not to act on it. Then one girl decided she had nothing left to lose. Her name was Sandra Goler. She was 14 years old. And on a cold morning in January 1984, she was sitting in class at her school in the valley when she started to cry. It wasn't a quiet cry. Not the kind you can hide behind a sleeve or swallow back before anyone notices. Sandra broke down. Full sobs. The teacher stopped the lesson, walked her out into the hallway, and asked what was wrong. Sandra told her. She said her father, William Dennis Goler, had been using her as a wife. Those were her words. Using me as a wife. She said it happened 10 to 15 times a month. She said he had forbidden her from using birth control because he wanted her to have his child. She said it had been going on for as long as she could remember. She was 14 years old, and she was describing things that no child should ever have to describe. The teacher brought Sandra to the principal. The principal called Family and Children's Services in Kentville. And for the first time in years, the first time in what might have been decades, someone on the other end of that phone actually listened. Not, we'll look into it. Not, send her home and we'll follow up. Actually listened. Actually acted. A social worker contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. An RCMP constable named Upsall was assigned to the case. He sat down with Sandra in a quiet room, and she gave him everything. Names, dates, locations, how often it happened, who else was involved, who else was in the room when it happened. She spoke plainly and clearly. She had been carrying this for her entire life, and now that she had finally found someone who was willing to hear it, she didn't hold a single thing back. But what Sandra said next changed the scope of the case entirely. It wasn't just her. Her sisters too. Donna, Lisa, the boys in the family, the cousins. It was every single child living in those shacks on South Mountain. Constable Upsall arranged to question Sandra's younger sisters. Donna was 11. Lisa was younger still. The officers were careful with them. They took their time. They were surprisingly gentle for men in uniform, and the social workers noticed it. They brought the girls burgers to eat. They let them talk at their own pace without pushing. Donna spoke for about an hour, answering questions quietly, giving short answers, keeping her eyes down. Then she stopped. She went completely still. She stared at the officer. Then she stared at the social worker. The room went dead silent. And then she said it. He done me too. I don't want him doing Lisa no more. That sentence cracked the whole case wide open. What followed was 2 full days of questioning that revealed the complete scale of what had been happening on South Mountain for generations. Children as young as 5 had been victims. The abuse came from every direction. Fathers, mothers, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, cousins. Sometimes all in the same room, sometimes all in the same day. William Dennis Goler was the worst of them. He had turned his own children into a form of currency. He traded access to them in exchange for beer, for cigarettes, sometimes just a single pack. Other adults from the clan would come to the shack, and the children would be lined up against a wall. The adults would pick the one they wanted. The children had no say. No protection, no voice, no one to call. The RCMP moved fast after that. They assembled a team and went up the mountain to raid the Goler property. Officers drove up those narrow dirt roads, past the tree line, into the thick of South Mountain. When they arrived at the shacks, what they found was worse than anything the children had described. Filthy clothing on the children. Rooms piled waist-high with garbage and rotting food. No running water. No toilets. No heat beyond a wood stove that barely worked. Adults sitting in the dark who could barely string a sentence together. The officers had been briefed. They thought they were prepared. They weren't. One constable later said he'd never seen living conditions like it in Canada. A world that had been rotting in place for 100 years while the valley below pretended it didn't exist. The children were removed immediately. All of them. Every last child in those shacks was pulled out and placed into temporary protective custody. Some of them had never been in a car before. Some of them had never eaten a meal at a table. The adults were arrested one by one. William Dennis Goler was taken first. Then his brothers. Then the uncles. Then the aunts. Then the cousins. By the end of the week, the shacks on South Mountain were empty for the first time in living memory. And then something happened that nobody expected. During interrogation, the adults didn't deny any of it. Several of them confessed openly and without hesitation. Some went into graphic detail. Some even boasted about what they had done, claiming the children had started it, that the children had wanted it. They described the abuse as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Because for them, inside that closed universe on the mountain, this was all they had ever known. Some of them couldn't even articulate why an officer was asking them questions about it. The RCMP could barely process what they were hearing. Detailed confessions, unprompted, on the record. No coercion needed. The prosecutors in Kentville looked at the evidence and the signed statements and breathed a sigh of relief. This case wasn't going to need much of a fight. The adults had admitted everything. The children were safe. Justice, for once, was going to be straightforward. For a brief, fragile moment, it looked like the hard part was over. The children were in protective care. The accused were behind bars. The confessions were signed and sealed. A small-town legal system that had never dealt with anything remotely like this prepared to process what seemed like an open-and-shut case. Investigators filed their reports. Social workers began arranging permanent placements. People in the valley exhaled. The nightmare on the mountain was finally over. Or so everyone believed. Then every single confession was withdrawn. One by one, the accused recanted. Every adult who had sat in that interrogation room and admitted in graphic detail to what they had done now said it never happened. They denied everything. Their lawyers argued that the confessions were coerced, that the accused were intellectually impaired and didn't understand what they were being asked, that the police had taken advantage of people who had never once dealt with the legal system in their entire lives. And just like that, the nature of the whole case changed. This was no longer a rescue operation. It was a legal war, and the battlefield was a courtroom that wasn't built for it. Now here's where it gets worse. Kings County didn't have the infrastructure for a case like this. Not even close. The entire county had one full-time prosecutor. One single lawyer handling the Crown's business. That prosecutor normally dealt with maybe 1 or 2 sexual assault cases a year, along with the usual thefts, assaults, and disorderly conduct charges. That was his whole workload. Now he was staring down 16 defendants and 137 separate criminal charges. And the only way to prove any of it was to put traumatized children on the witness stand and ask them to testify against their own parents, their own uncles, their own family. Think about that for a second. One prosecutor, 137 charges, and children as the primary witnesses. The defense attorneys went straight at the children's credibility. They argued the kids had been coached by police and social workers. They argued the kids were confused, that children from such extreme isolation couldn't reliably describe what had happened to them or distinguish fantasy from reality. They questioned the children's intelligence. They questioned their motives. It was a brutal, grinding legal strategy. And it was effective, too, because these weren't polished witnesses. They were traumatized children from the backwoods of Nova Scotia who had never seen the inside of a courtroom. didn't understand what cross-examination meant, and were terrified of the adults sitting across the room. Meanwhile, the media descended. National press, television cameras. Reporters from Toronto and Ottawa and Halifax arrived in the valley to cover what the papers were already calling a hillbilly sex ring. The Annapolis Valley, that postcard-perfect landscape of orchards and white fences, was suddenly the most talked-about place in Canada. For the worst possible reason. Camera crews filmed the road up to South Mountain. Newspapers printed maps showing how close the Goler shacks were to Acadia University. The contrast was irresistible to editors. Beauty and horror, separated by a 15-minute drive. And the community cracked in two. Some people demanded justice. They were horrified by what had been uncovered, and they wanted every last one of the accused locked away for as long as the law would allow. But others wanted the whole thing buried. They were embarrassed, furious, not at the Golers, at the attention. They felt the national media was dragging their valley's reputation through the mud. They wanted the cameras gone, the reporters gone, the story forgotten. And underneath all of that, a deeper and more uncomfortable truth was surfacing. One that nobody in the valley wanted to sit with. This had not happened in a vacuum. Doctors had examined these children for years and noticed signs they chose to ignore. Social workers had walked through those shacks and filed reports that went nowhere. Teachers had watched Goler children come to school bruised, underfed, and terrified, and done nothing beyond noting it in a file. As far back as 1980, children from the family had directly reported the abuse to authorities. They told adults in positions of power exactly what was being done to them, and those adults sent them back. Every single time. The system hadn't just failed. It had participated through its silence. A CBC News crew later tracked down one of the convicted Goler men after he'd served a short sentence. He was 57 years old. Doctors had classified him as mentally disabled. He stood in front of the camera, confused, and told the reporter he still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He said he was just living life the way he always had, the way his father had, the way his grandfather had. That interview aired across the country. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because the worst part of the story isn't what happened on the mountain. It's what happened in the courtroom. Without the confessions, the prosecution's entire case now rested on the testimony of children. There was no forensic evidence that could stand alone. The standards of 1984 weren't what they are today. The shacks had been contaminated during the raid. There was no DNA technology to fall back on. The prosecution needed those kids to get on the stand, face the adults who had abused them, and tell a roomful of strangers exactly what had been done to them. Every detail, every name, every act, under oath, under cross-examination, under the gaze of their own fathers. And the single most important witness of all was 11-year-old Donna Goler. Donna had been pulled from the Goler household and placed into foster care. She was small for her age. She was quiet. She had spent her entire life being told that what happened to her was normal, and that talking about it would bring punishment. Now she was being asked to walk into a courtroom and say all of it out loud, in front of strangers, with her father sitting 10 feet away watching her. The prosecutor and the defense attorneys would later agree on exactly one thing. Donna's testimony was the single most important piece of evidence presented at trial. Everything. Every charge, every conviction, every year of prison time. It all hung on whether an 11-year-old girl, pulled from a tar paper shack on a mountain nobody cared about, could convince a court that she was telling the truth. William Dennis Goler was tried first. It was July of 1984. 6 counts of sexual intercourse with a female under the age of 14. He sat in the courtroom in Kentville, a thick-built man from the mountain, and for the first time in his life, the outside world was looking directly at him. Not with pity, not with the usual valley contempt. With judgment, Donna took the stand. She was small enough that her feet didn't touch the floor. But when she started talking, the room went silent. Not courtroom quiet, the kind of silence where people forget to breathe. She described what her father had done to her, starting when she was 5 years old. She described the trading, how William would let other adults from the clan have access to his children in exchange for beer or cigarettes, sometimes just a single pack. She described how the children would be lined up against a wall and chosen like items on a shelf. She described how they had no say in any of it, no way to stop it, no way to leave, no one who would help. She didn't cry on the stand. She didn't hesitate. She spoke like someone who had been waiting her entire short life for a single person to finally ask her what happened and actually want to hear the answer. William Dennis Goler was convicted on all 6 counts. After that, the trials came one after another. Separate proceedings for separate family members, stretching over months. Some of the accused were tried individually. Others were tried in small groups. The details that emerged in each trial were as bad as the ones that came before. Worse, in several cases, the abuse had been so widespread, so routine, so constant that some witnesses had trouble distinguishing one incident from another. Not because they were confused or lying, because there had been too many incidents to separate them. Hundreds of acts blurred into a single, unending nightmare. In the end, 13 of the 16 accused were convicted. The sentences ranged from 1 to 7 years. William Dennis Goler received the heaviest sentence, 7 years in prison. His nephew, William James Goler, got 4.5 years. Juanita, William's wife and the only woman formally charged, received 4 years. The rest of the convicted received between 1 and 3 years each. Let that settle for a moment. 1 to 7 years. For the systematic abuse of children as young as 5. For a pattern of assault and exploitation that stretched across multiple generations of one family. For crimes that numbered in the hundreds. The heaviest sentence handed down by the court was 7 years. Several of the convicted would be out in less time than Donna had spent being abused. The valley absorbed the verdicts in something close to silence. Some people were outraged at the leniency and said so publicly. Others were just relieved that it was finished. The media pulled out of the valley. The cameras left Kentville. The courtroom went back to handling its usual handful of petty thefts and neighborhood disputes. But the story didn't end with the verdicts. Because the most telling detail about the Goler case didn't come from the courtroom at all. Came from the local library. Years after the trials, a pair of investigative journalists named David Cruz and Allison Griffith spent years digging into every corner of the case. They reviewed court transcripts. They interviewed survivors, social workers, and officials. They traced the history of the South Mountain clans back 2 centuries. In 1997, they published a book, On South Mountain, The Dark Secrets of the Goler Clan. That book became the most stolen item in the Annapolis Valley library system. Not the most borrowed, the most stolen. People wanted to read it. They were desperate to read it. But they didn't want their name on the checkout card. They didn't want the librarian to see them picking it up. They didn't want anyone to know they were curious about what had happened on the mountain. The same instinct that had kept the entire valley quiet for 100 years was still operating. People wanted to know the truth. They just didn't want to be seen wanting to know. And the book laid bare not just the crimes of the Goler family, but the long, calculated silence of the community that surrounded them. It showed how doctors, social workers, teachers, church officials, and ordinary neighbors had all held pieces of the puzzle for decades. It showed how the valley's rigid social divide, the invisible wall between mountain people and valley people, between respectable and other, had made it possible and even comfortable to look the other way. The Golers were mountain folk. What happened up there was mountain business. Except it was never just mountain business. Every time a teacher saw a Goler child covered in bruises and chose to say nothing, it became the valley's business. Every time a social worker visited those shacks and sent a child back into them, it became the valley's business. Every time a doctor examined a Goler child and chose not to ask the question that needed asking, it was the valley's responsibility. and the valley walked away from that responsibility again and again and again. The Goler case wasn't just about one broken family on a mountain. It was about every person who had the authority and the opportunity to stop it and chose not to use either. After the trials, the 12 Goler children were placed into foster care across Nova Scotia and given new identities. New names, new addresses, new towns where nobody knew the name Goler. The idea was to give them a fresh start, a clean break from the mountain and everything it represented. But it didn't work out that cleanly. It almost never does. The children were separated from one another. Brothers from sisters. Donna from her younger siblings. Some were placed in group homes. Some were adopted by families. Some bounced between placements. The system that had rescued them did not know how to heal them. These were children who had been raised in near-total isolation from the modern world. Many had developmental delays caused by years of neglect and inbreeding. Some had behavioral problems rooted so deep in normalized abuse that therapists didn't know where to begin. They didn't understand how the world worked outside those shacks. School was foreign to them. Routine was foreign. Trust was foreign. The transition from South Mountain to anything resembling a normal childhood was brutal and incomplete. Donna and her younger sister were effectively estranged after the foster placements pulled them apart. They had survived the same house, endured the same horrors, testified in the same courtrooms against the same people. And then the system drew a line between them and sent them to different families in different towns to live different lives. That separation haunted Donna for years afterward. But Donna survived. And she did more than survive. She fought back. As she grew older, Donna Goler became an activist. She spoke publicly about what had happened to her family on South Mountain. She used her real name, her actual Goler name. She refused to hide behind the new identity the foster system had given her. She went to Ottawa and she lobbied members of Parliament for changes to Canadian child protection law. Her central demand was straightforward. Convicted child abusers should never be allowed unsupervised access to children within their own families. Not ever. It sounds so obvious that you'd think the law already covered it. But in the 1980s and 1990s, it didn't. There were gaps in the system wide enough to drive a truck through. Donna wanted those gaps closed, and she pushed for it relentlessly. She went to Parliament. She gave interviews to national media. She wrote letters to legislators. She told her story again and again and again. Not because it got easier with the telling. It never got easier. She did it because she believed that if enough people in positions of power heard what had happened to the children on South Mountain, something in the law would eventually shift. And here is where the story comes full circle. In the worst possible way, William Dennis Goler served his 7-year sentence. He was released from prison, and upon his release, he sexually assaulted another child. The man who had traded his own children for cigarettes and beer, who had been convicted on 6 counts, who had sat in a courtroom while his 11-year-old daughter described what he had done to her. That man walked out of prison and did it again. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about how the system handled this case. 7 years for a lifetime of abuse. Release without meaningful monitoring. No restrictions strong enough to prevent what everyone involved should have seen coming. The cycle that had repeated for a century on South Mountain was not broken by the trials. It was barely interrupted. The shacks themselves are gone now. Torn down sometime after the trials and the media left. Nobody in the valley will tell you exactly where they stood. There are no markers on the mountain. No memorials. No signs. The wood from those buildings was reportedly hauled away and repurposed as chicken coops. That's not a figure of speech. The structures where children were tortured for generations were officially deemed unfit for human habitation and given to poultry farmers. The name Goler still carries weight in the Annapolis Valley. For years after the trials, local kids kept using it as a schoolyard insult, the same way they had before everything came out. A word for someone dirty, backward, or strange. Most of the children using it didn't know the full story behind the word. They just knew it meant something bad. Something that happened up on the mountain that decent people didn't talk about. And that's the thing that stays with you long after the details fade. Not the crimes themselves, as terrible as they were. What stays with you is the distance. The gap between knowing something is wrong and doing something about it. The way an entire community could live 15 minutes from a horror that lasted a century and convince itself, year after year, generation after generation, that it wasn't their problem. That it was mountain business. That someone else would handle it. The Annapolis Valley is still beautiful. The apple orchards still bloom every spring. Acadia University still sits at the heart of Wolfville, surrounded by clean streets and green lawns. South Mountain still rises above it all, thick with trees, quiet as it has always been. But if you drive up there today, past the last paved road, past the point where the cell signal drops out and the trees close in overhead, you'll find a clearing where two shacks used to stand. There's nothing left, just grass growing over where the foundations were. The mountain took it all back. Sandra Goler was 14 years old when she pushed open that door and told the truth. She did what adults with badges and degrees and government salaries had refused to do for decades. She spoke up. And because she spoke, her sisters spoke too. And because they spoke, those children were pulled out of the darkness and given at least a chance at something different. It wasn't enough. The sentences were too light. The foster system was imperfect. The healing was incomplete. William reoffended. The community never fully reckoned with its own long silence. But Sandra spoke, and Donna testified, and the door that had been sealed for 100 years was finally broken open by the smallest hands in the room. That is the story of the Goler clan. Not a story about monsters hiding on a mountain. A story about what happens when an entire valley of good people decides that the mountain is not their concern. It was always their concern. They just chose not to look.